Welcome to a new webinar of the section of evolutionary psychiatry at the World Psychiatric Association. I'm Riyad Abid, chair of the section. Our speaker today is one of the foremost thinkers and authors on evolution and psychiatry in the world today, whose output is required reading, in my view, for all psychiatrists, but especially so for evolutionists. Jerome Wakefield is professor of social work, affiliate professor of philosophy, associate faculty in the Center of Bioethics in the School of Global Public Health at New York University. He's author of over 300 publications in the philosophy of psychiatry and psychiatric epidemiology, and is the author and co-author or editor of 7 books. His book with Alan Horowitz, The Loss of Sadness, How Psychiatry Transformed Normal Sorrow into Depressive Disorder, published in 2007, was named as Best Psychology Book for 2007 by the Association of Professional and Scholarly Publishers. His forthcoming book is titled Foucault versus Freud, Oedipal Theory and the Deployment of Sexuality, which is due to be released in July, and I'm sure will be of interest to many psychiatrists and psychologists. His title today is The Loss of Sadness and the Pathologizing of Grief. Are we medicalizing normal human emotions? So over to you, Jerry.
Thank you, Riyad. I'm honored to be here. I think it's wonderful that there is a section on evolutionary psychiatry in the WPA. And so the first thing to say is that this is an enormous topic with so many different important arguments and important considerations. And so I'm really going to be picking a few points, saying a few things, and then open to questions where we can develop the topics further in a more specific way. So I think the first thing that needs to be said is that from a conceptual professional perspective, what is a mental disorder? What's the framework that I'm going to be using for discussing emotions like sadness and grief? And so here, I'll be approaching things from my own developed perspective, which is very widely discussed and is accepted by many in the field, although by no means is it non-controversial. And that is what I have labeled the harmful dysfunction analysis. Now, the harmful dysfunction analysis talks about what is a mental disorder. And that is different from what is a mental problem or a psychological problem or what is distress. Now, I want to say right at the outset that treatment is not determined by diagnosis in a one-to-one fashion, in the sense that a diagnosis of disorder means treatment, a diagnosis of non-disorder means non-treatment. Many people confuse that, and then they get upset if somebody says that's not a disorder because they can't gain treatment and insurance reimbursement. And other people get upset because if you say it is a disorder, they feel that that's in some way saying something's wrong with them. So I'm looking at this from a conceptual perspective. What is medicine? One of the most distinguished, helpful, and longest professions in our civilization. What does it mean by a disorder, a medical disorder? What has it always meant? For 2,000 years, let's say, or actually, to go back to Hippocrates, about 2,400 years. People have recognized disorders for all that time. And remarkably, this is kind of amazing if you start to think about it. the conditions that they recognized as disorders 2,400 years ago, as medical disorders, not psychiatric specifically, are all today recognized, almost all today. There's a few conceptual errors, but basically they're all recognized today as disorders. Now, the theories are different, the categorizations are different because we understand them better and we've reorganized our thinking theoretically. But the ability to recognize what is a breakdown in natural human functioning, while we get it wrong sometimes, terribly wrong, and we often exploit it for social purposes and purposely get it wrong in order to subject some group to treatment in order to make them conform with social mores. The fact is that there is a very powerful and compelling ability to recognize when what appears to be natural or biologically designed functioning is going wrong. That, I think, is at the heart of the notion of disorder, and biologically designed functioning is at the heart of the notion of biological function. Now, function is used in many, many different ways. We know that not all uses of function refer to proper biological functioning. For instance, you have the whole to-do about research that changes functions, let's say in viruses, to see if you can make them more aggressive than they are so we can see how to handle them or what is the threat from them. And that's called, enhancement of function. I'm not getting that phrase quite right, but gain of function, that's the phrase. Gain of function is using function in a different way. It's saying that whatever the function is, you're changing it to something that isn't what it's biologically designed to be. Similarly, we say, I'm not functional at work this week because I'm obsessed with Wordle or whatever. My marriage has become dysfunctional. We're at each other's throats all the time. We have to go see somebody. This use of dysfunction is a personal or value-laden use of dysfunction, in which we are thinking about some goal we have, happy marriage, let's say, or being good at work, and then we're not living up to that. And so we are not functioning, performing in the way that we would like to or that we value. So function can be used in all these ways. So in medicine, obviously, you don't have a disorder every time you have a dysfunctional marriage. You don't have a disorder, a medical disorder, every time you are not functioning well at work. So what is the meaning of function and its corresponding concept, dysfunction, in medicine? That's what we're after in a conceptual analysis in the philosophy of psychiatry and philosophy of medicine. And it seems to me the only answer can be, and of course this is a long argument and I won't go through it today, or that's all we'll do. It seems to me the only answer is what we're talking about is what is biologically designed. And since Darwin, we understand that biological design is evolutionarily designed or naturally selected. Now, let me just clarify something. Aristotle, Hippocrates, Galen, Harvey, all of these classic physicians and philosophers understood the notion of biological design. Lucretius has a whole theory about how it comes about that's very close to natural selection, but they didn't get what Darwin got, which was that species could change. That's a different issue. But the point is, everybody's always understood that the fundamental mystery in biology is, why are we so adapted? How do we live? How do we have fear when there's danger, hunger when we need food that keeps us alive? How is everything so darn neatly designed that organisms can survive and reproduce? On the surface, it seems like a miraculous thing, and so many people through the eons have taken a religious view. Must be that some intelligence greater than ours has done this. And what I want to say about this is, and I know that one can argue, and there may be theists in the group here, but from my perspective, that was not a completely nutty thing to think until we figured out what really happened. What really happened was natural selection, and not a theistic creation. Now, the point I want to make is that although people didn't understand evolution, they understood that there was biological design. Hands just can't accidentally have come about to grasp and hold and do all the things we do with them. Eyes couldn't just accidentally come about to see. Now, in a certain sense, they did, but then natural selection is what made them part of our enduring biology. So this is an amazing insight. And, you know, earlier thinkers talk about biological design in various ways. You go back to Harvey, look at sprinkled through Harvey's work on the heart is the phrase nature's purpose. Even in Descartes, for instance, there's nature's purpose. They tried to understand in some way how this miraculous seeming thing could have happened. We are lucky enough currently to live in an era where we have a deep insight into this. Maybe not the last insight. We still don't understand how the universe could possibly start. We don't understand how consciousness can exist, and what its relationship exactly is to the brain. But we do understand biological design. And so we understand then how to think about medical disorder and health in a more precise way than people have before. We still base our initial judgments on intuitions about biological design. So, for instance, you didn't have to understand evolution and know that if somebody has a broken arm or goes blind, that something's going wrong with the way we're biologically designed. And similarly, in psychiatry, you don't have to have even a notion of evolution to know, as ancients did, that bipolar disorder or gross schizophrenic kinds of positive symptoms were disorders of the human mind. Now, we are where, not quite, but let me exaggerate slightly and say we are now in the mental health field, roughly where Galen was in the physical health field. We're trying to understand the causes and the functions of these various things, and even the most salient ones are not yet understood. I mean, take sleep. Sleep is probably the single most harmful condition of the human race. It steals 1/3 of the lifespan of every single human being, roughly speaking. And we are rendered socially impaired, to say the least. We can't function. We are periodically hallucinating and semi-paralyzed during those periods, so we don't harm ourselves, apparently. Evolution's been kind to us in that way. So, a horrifically harmful condition. Why isn't it a disorder? Because the contextual facts suggest that it's biologically designed, not only universally in our species, but across species, and so on and so forth. Here's an interesting fact. Read the literature on sleep, the latest literature. People are still quite confused about what the function of sleep is. And I know there's some recent theories about cleaning the brain and all that. Looks like those can't be the adequate answer, because organisms that don't even have the kinds of issues we have with cleaning the brain sleep also, or have a period analogous to sleep. So without going into the details, my point is we don't really understand something as salient as sleep that takes up 1/3 of our lifespan. Sure, we don't understand depression. We don't understand anxiety conditions. We don't understand more subtle mental disorders of which there are so many. But if you look at the various mental disorders that are classified in the DSM, you can quickly see that the chapters and the categories are in areas where we do feel, sort of like Hippocrates did 2,400 years ago, we feel pretty confident that we can make a judgment about that there is some biological design failing here. So thought, emotions like anxiety, we see they have a certain function, and when they're happening in a way that's totally unrelated to that function, we think something must have gone wrong. Sadness, and so on. Eating disorders, and all the other disorders, sexual disorders. We see areas where we think we have a sense of biological design and things have gone wrong. And what is good about our era now is that because we understand evolutionary theory, we can start to understand what are the functions of these things that are going wrong, what might be correlated with these dysfunctions of biologically designed areas, and we might be able to design and come up with new ideas about how to design ways of treating them. Now, shifting to another side of this whole issue. What I've said so far means that diagnostic manuals should be evolutionarily based in principle, to the degree we can at any given stage of knowledge. But the problem is that because of our lack of precise knowledge, very often there's a lot of judgment calls made and a lot of extraneous considerations that go into how the diagnostic manuals that are used to guide diagnosis of patients are created. And one of the areas I've focused on in recent years is depression and grief as areas where I believe that the diagnostic manuals, in an understandable way, in a well-intentioned way perhaps, that you want to help people. And again, treatment decisions are not determined by whether there's a mental disorder. We decide treatment decisions by broader value considerations. Just an aside, consider birth control. I think most people believe, of course, doctors should prescribe birth control. There's no disorder being addressed there. It's because we think that's so basic to our social structure, to the way people choose to live their lives, to opportunity across the sexes and so on, that we have incorporated much reproductive medicine into medical responsibilities and insured ones that really have not much to do with disorder per se. Similarly, it's sort of self-defeating that our culture in America, especially I'm talking about, tends to restrict reimbursement to disorders because there's so many conditions where it would do our culture, do individuals good to be helped and to have it supported, even though they might not have a mental disorder. I consider grief to be one of those areas. So what I'm about to say in criticism is not meant to preclude anybody being helped. But what I do believe is, on the basis of an analysis of these diagnostic categories, I do believe that they have overshot the mark of disorder and incorporated large amounts of normal human emotion within the psychiatric manual. Why is this important? Does it matter? First of all, normal emotions are likely to be generated in different ways than truly disordered emotions that might well have some specific etiology. If you mix them together, your research is going to be kind of watered down and screwed up in terms of what you can conclude from the study. So we want ideologically homogeneous groups optimally for research, and disorder versus non-disorder is a way of dividing out, at least initially, some ideologically differential groups. Similarly, for understanding, we want to try to understand various conditions and understanding, let's say, how fear works. That's one thing. We still don't really, we really don't have a full understanding of virtually any psychological capacities. But as in physical medicine, it often happens that a disorder of a biologically designed system can be isolated to some degree and understood in terms of some deviation or causal factor without understanding the entire background system. So this could help us to help people by identifying etiologies if we can separate out the disordered conditions. But also for policy purposes, who needs help most? For prognostic purposes, generally non-disorders will tend to ameliorate on their own, and so on. So I'll put that aside for now and assume that we can agree that, at least in principle, it's an important question what is a disorder and what's not a disorder, in the sense of when something has gone biologically, has a dysfunction and something's gone wrong with a mechanism, versus when it's inconvenient, it's painful, but it's the natural functioning of our mechanisms. So, as Foucault, the philosopher Michel Foucault, who said a lot of silly things along the way, but one thing he said that actually is not silly at all is that cultures use the categories of disorder and health in order to back up their social values. Thus, we will use categorizations, and we're not immune to this. Our sophisticated, science-driven culture is not immune to doing the same thing. So, there's classic examples that we don't need to run through in detail, but the Soviet Union had sluggish schizophrenia. Anybody who protests the beautiful Soviet system must have something wrong with them. And they got diagnosed with having a very subtle form of schizophrenia that develops very slowly, so slowly that initial evaluation might not entirely reveal it, but you can tell from their activities that they're slowly succumbing. And then these people were removed, these protesters, these dissenters were removed from society. Similarly, the classic case of drapetomania in antebellum America has been talked about many, many times, where Southern physicians suggested that slaves running away must have a mental disorder, because isn't this their natural place? And somehow something must be going wrong for them to run away and not want to take their natural place. Now, notice that behind each of these idiotic diagnoses, there is nonetheless a theory of human nature that supports the biological design notion, right? Let's take another classic example. Victorian physician, the most famous Victorian physician of sexuality, William Acton, held that female clitoral orgasm is a disorder. If it happened too frequently or too intensely, it was not the way women were designed to function. Masters and Johnson, much later sexual physicians, argued that a woman who doesn't have clitoral orgasms is disordered, because women are designed to have clitoral orgasms, and they explained how this is supposed to happen in a mechanical way during intercourse. Now, these two folks couldn't be further apart on a basic issue of pleasure. And yet, what's interesting about it from a conceptual, theoretical perspective is that both of them had theories of human nature, of biological design. Acton's was more theistically founded, but still a solid Victorian notion of how women and men are designed. And Masters and Johnson had a 1960s American notion of how women and men are designed. Are supposed to be designed. So biological design goes behind all of this. Now, with sadness and grief, what's the problem? Um, mm, Oh, this was supposed to remind you. Sorry, I never got started with these slides. This was supposed to remind you that medicine has many different uh, goals. It not only, its core is to treat, psychiatry in particular, is to treat mental disorder, but it also helps people cope with stress, enhances human potential, and so on. So we're not eliminating all those other functions. And I've already talked about the concept of mental disorder and my notion of harmful dysfunction. To be a disorder, something has to be a failure of how a mechanism is biologically designed to function, and it has to do harm. I mean, there's failures of biological dysfunction in your genes, millions of them every time you go into the sun. When the sun falls on your nose, there's various genetic anomalies that occur. Most of them are not harmful. Nobody cares. It's not a disorder. Similarly, there's all sorts of odd things happening. When they're neutral to us and to our values, nobody really cares. They would not be medical disorders. But when they harm you, then they become classifiable as medical disorders only if there is a genuine dysfunction. There's so many harms in human life, unfortunately, that are not dysfunctions. There are other kinds of harms of all kinds, from poverty to foolhardiness and personality traits that are not so good for you, and social conditions and contexts that are not so good for you, and just bad luck in life. A bad marriage, as we discussed before. These are terrible things that bring great unhappiness, but they're not dysfunctions of your biological design. Therefore, we do not consider them disorders. Okay. So I'm saying you need both the dysfunction and the harm, not one or the other, to have a disorder. Harm isn't enough. There's lots of harms that aren't disorders. Dysfunction isn't enough. There's lots of dysfunctions that aren't harmful. We could care less. Now, in the last couple of decades, for the first time in the history of psychiatry, there has been a persistent effort to change diagnostic categories in a way that tends to create diagnoses around grief. I don't know how else to put it, but it does seem like there has, since the late 1990s, I would say, been a sustained and persistent and systematic attempt to pathologize certain forms of grief. Now, why is this? So one reason could be because we just haven't paid enough attention. And there's people who have disorders of grief and of sadness, depression. So put those together here. I'm going to talk about their interaction a bit. So that's entirely possible. It's entirely possible that we weren't focusing enough on the fact that there are people with dysfunctions of these emotions that we've been ignoring and kind of assuming, oh, it's just part of normality, but really they have a disorder. Another possibility is that as society becomes more demanding of us, negative emotions become somewhat less acceptable in terms of socially impairing us, withdrawing from things, dealing with it as a different kind of mode of human existence. Social support is less available especially in a very mobile society like American society is today. Because I'm going to be mostly talking about DSM here, so I'm going to be referring to some degree to the United States, although this is all mostly true of Europe as well, and other places, although in some areas less so. So we have this intolerance of emotional variability, a need to be efficient. So that's another possible explanation. A third possible explanation is that, much more narrow, that getting a disorder into DSM and into ICD, for that matter, opens up a spigot of funding, of research funding, of insurance funding, so that rather than it being a mega social issue, it could be a more narrow sociology of medicine issue where people see that this would be a good thing for them in their field. Doesn't mean they're all nefarious, selfish, people. It means they could be saying to themselves, well, I think this is a disorder, and anyway, I could help more people. Clinicians want to help people. And even though most clinicians that you speak to, ask them at a party when their guard is down, I have, most clinicians, if you ask them, of your patients, how many actually have a mental disorder versus they're just distressed and you're helping them, or they're not doing well in school, but they're not really ADHD, but you're going to give them a drug anyway to help them? How many? You will get sizable percentages from most clinicians saying, well, I really don't think half my clients have a true mental disorder. I think they're in distress and I'm going to help them because they need help. They deserve help. And that's what I said earlier. Our system is self-defeating. People deserve help, need help. It would be good for our system to help them. We should help them without begrudging them and without having to classify them as mentally disordered. Okay. Now, so there's all these possible motivations here, but let's just look at the logic of it from the harmful dysfunction perspective. Depression, it's often said, occurs on a dimension from slight sadness up to intense, profound depressive illness or depression. And that's true, of course. But if the harmful dysfunction view is right, then we've left out a dimension. That is, that could be called a dimension of emotional harm, if you want to call it harmful, to have these negative emotions. Let's just, without arguing about this for the moment, because many people say, oh, well, grief is good, sadness leads you to new insights. But let's leave all that aside for a second. Let's just say, okay, on its face, having these negative emotions is something most people would prefer not to have most of the time. So let's call it a harm. So then you have this dimension from, I'm feeling a little out of sorts today, up to profound, perhaps suicidal, profound sadness. So the harmful dysfunction view says, hey, you can't just cut that dimension like that without thinking about dysfunction. That is, isn't it true that even normal sadness and grief can be profoundly intense and painful, and that we wouldn't call a dysfunction at all? If you think of classic sources, think of Achilles in the Iliad falling into the dirt over his friend Patroclus being killed, falling into the dirt, screaming, putting ashes on himself, groveling. You can't imagine something more intense than what Homer describes there. And interestingly, this is universal. I mean, go back another 2,000 years past the Iliad to the Babylonian myths, and you find equally intense descriptions of grief as basically destroying a person's ability to function at that time and giving them intense agony. So what we see here is the potential for a confusion between intensity of pain and disorder. So for instance, no doctor thinks, even though we want to stop it as much as we can, no doctor thinks that the horrific pain of childbirth is a disorder, they think, well, it's a horrific thing. We've got to stop that if we can, and we do stop it. But when we can, but it's not a disorder because it's not a dysfunction. It's part of the way birth goes, biologically designed to go. So that's what they think. Now, so similarly here, we have to ask, what is a dysfunction and what is not a dysfunction when it comes to sadness? Now, with dimensions like this, there are many special problems in choosing where to cut the line, and maybe a cut point isn't even what's happening. You have many reasons for having a problem here. One reason, emphasized by somebody who's here today, Randy Nesse, is what's called the smoke detector principle. Very intense emotions that seem out of proportion to what seems sensible may be biologically designed because it's better to have an intense emotion and avoid something or respond to something in the environment than it is to have a more modest, carefully honed response that might get you in trouble that 1 or 2 times out of 100 where the threat is really big and you didn't realize it. So to some degree, just like your smoke detector goes off, or mine does when I'm cooking fish in the kitchen and I curse under my breath and have to deal with it. But do I turn it off? Do I try to get it modulated? No, because the one time there's going to be a real fire in my apartment when I'm asleep and there's smoke at that level, I want it to wake me. And being irritated for all the times I cook fish, which is actually rather frequently, is worth it to avoid that one real fire. Now, similarly, intense emotions very often might be a smoke detector kind of thing. So we can't just say, oh, intense emotion, negative emotion, that must be a dysfunction. There's a half a dozen of these kinds of reasons, really. First of all, evolution isn't perfect. Obviously, it does what's efficient. So let's say, for example, I can recognize garter snakes pretty well, and I know garter snakes are harmless. I can tell you when a garter snake jumped into the pool with me a few years back, I was out of that effing pool so fast, I was like Superman. I actually thought I flew out of the water. And, Darwin describes a similar case. He knew a snake was behind glass. He was totally safe. Yet when it tried to strike, he jumped. We aren't designed necessarily to pick out harmless versus harmful snakes. Maybe that's just too sophisticated, and then we're going to go wrong that one time that's fatal. So instead, we've got a generic snake fear mechanism that tends to be triggered by early experiences. So you have a situation where our culture tends to think of dysfunction in an Aristotelian kind of way as, oh, something's going wrong if you're not being rational. But evolutionary mechanisms aren't designed to correspond to a rational judgment in that individual case. They're designed to deal with an environmental threat or problem in a general sense, on average, that's going to keep you alive and reproducing overall on average. So we have all these problems with finding cut points in these dimensions. And I'm not going to, and there's a lot of thinking about how to do that. One of us here, Adam Hunt, has in recent work been working on that and trying to figure out how we might use fitness and other evolutionary concepts to figure out what parts of these dimensions are disordered and which aren't. So I'm going to take a different tack today, which is not as explicitly evolutionary, but I'm going to show you the sort of thing I've done. I've done a dozen studies in this area. They all support each other in the kind of thing I'm going to be showing you, but let's just see what can be done in a different way. So when you look at the rationale for classifying depression as a disorder. The original rationale was actually in the 1800s was really, and to lesser extent, classically, melancholia, was that it was wildly disproportional. Okay, that's something, but we've seen that's not conclusive. That it went on, and that it had severe symptoms that didn't seem to be the kind of symptoms that were characteristic of normal sadness. So, what can we make of this? Now, when DSM-3 was created in 1980, which is the first kind of manual of the sort we have now that lays out how to diagnose disorder, the idea was, yes, well, if somebody's grieving, they probably shouldn't be classified as having depression because depression's a normal part of grieving. And this is the evidence on which that was based. Paula Clayton did a study in which she took people who were not patients, but they were first-rank relatives. She was working in a hospital when somebody died. She identified first-rank members of their family and asked them if they would be in this study. And then she followed up these folks for a couple of years. Just to give you an example, the symptoms that are used to diagnose depression were some of the things she asked these people about periodically during the next 2 years. Now, this is just one cut of this, but the point is, if you see here, that first interview was done within a month or two of the loss. And what you see is that the symptoms that are typically used to diagnose depression occurred in very high levels in this presumably normally grieving group. They weren't patients, they weren't seeing anybody, they were just first-rank people who had died. And we see depressed mood, sleep disturbance, crying, difficulty concentrating, loss of interest. All of these are symptoms that the DSM uses to diagnose depressive disorder. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't show that, and maybe we'll get to that in a couple of slides. The point is, those symptoms. The point is, what she saw was that if you weren't careful, you would confuse grief with pathological depression. And so in DSM originally, they put a bereavement exclusion saying, don't diagnose it if people just lost somebody. And if they only have these kinds of modest symptoms that are more associated with stress rather than really profound. If you had a symptom like suicidal ideation, or you felt profoundly worthless, all your self-esteem totally destroyed, or you had psychomotor retardation where you were moving and speaking and even thinking very slowly, these are indicators people thought maybe there is dysfunction going on. So then you could still diagnose it even during grief. But if you only had these other symptoms that seem consistent with stress and distress, then don't diagnose it. Now, I call this the original sin of modern psychiatric epidemiology, because any person with half an evolutionary brain would have said, well, this isn't just something that applies to grief. Any kind of loss would come under the same argument. Let's see what happens when other losses occur. But they didn't do that. In fact, I've actually interviewed people who were on the committee, and they said, we never even considered that. Paula Clayton, in an article, argued for considering it. She said, look, this isn't going to be any different if you take people who've lost their jobs, lost all their money, had a marital breakup against, something with somebody that they loved, and so on. You're going to have the same issue. Don't confuse that with mental disorder. But they didn't consider it. And so let's just look at this. Let's take all the symptoms that DSM mentions about sadness and and uses to diagnose depression. Now, I want to tell you something about the symptoms that DSM uses. They were not originally designed for the purpose of a cut point on a dimension like that of sadness to distinguish dysfunctional sadness from functional sadness or designed sadness responses. They were designed in experiments back in the 40s and 50s that were aimed at identifying depressed individuals that entered hospitals who were being mistaken because of the somatic symptoms that go along with depression. They were being regularly mistaken for people with organic and physical disorders. And therefore, the psych ward was getting these people 6 months or 3 months later and saying, oh my God, we could have been treating this person. Let's figure out a way of screening people that the emergency people and the people who do intake won't mistake them for people who have a physical disorder. So if you look at sadness, insomnia, loss of interest, thinking about death, decrease, these are things that are not, I mean, they happen, of course, but these are things that are not characteristic of physical disorders, generally speaking. They are more characteristic of depression and sadness. So the idea in these studies was to create a set of criteria that would distinguish the physically disordered from the depressed patients. Now, it doesn't take a statistical genius to understand that the criteria that managed to do that may not be the same criteria that optimally distinguish intense normal sadness from pathological level sadness. That's a whole different problem. And when psychiatry moved into the community away from the asylum, it was suddenly faced with a community, not handpicked people that came into, that had severe conditions and probably all had disorders of some kind coming into a hospital, but a mass of people in the community that had all levels of emotional distress for all different reasons, normal and disordered. And so, really, these criteria were designed for something else and never meant to do this, what we do with them, but this is what we do with them. So we took all the symptoms in DSM. I had several other people who are familiar with the harmful dysfunction analysis, and it was, not your most formal process, I admit, but it was a bit of flying by the seat of your pants type thing. But we had people independently evaluate which of these could you say, yeah, if that's happening, at least that's an argument, maybe not conclusive, but it's an argument that maybe something's gone wrong with what I intuitively think sadness might be designed to do. Now, this is very vague and very controversial, but here's what we got. We got things like sadness, crying, a bit of impairment. I mean, look, we even recognize that people are normally grieving are impaired. We have all sorts of rituals and situations where we take them out of the job or of social gatherings for a while and support them. So, some degree of role impairment is normal with intense negative emotions. So loss of interest, thinking about death. So it's interesting. I don't know if I'll get to this, but if you thinking about death here doesn't necessarily mean suicidality. That got confused. That is to say, if you look at people who have recently lost somebody, they're very high on thinking about death. But then if you do a sub-analysis of which of the questions they actually answered, it's not suicidality, it's just thinking about death in general. And that's understandable, of course. So you've got to get into the nuances of these things to really understand what's going on. My point is that we made a distinction here and then we used it in some studies. So I'm just going to present one of these studies to you right now. As I say, I've done a dozen of them, and they're all interesting in their own ways and make different points, but they all overlap in the overall perspective they give. So I said to myself, basically, look, since we can't have a conclusive evolutionary argument or ideological argument, but we know what led to this condition being classified as a disorder, namely that it was repetitive. I didn't say this before, but the single most critical point was that people said that once you get it, it recurs. And this shows, people still say this today in articles, this shows that there's an internal dysfunction that's lurking there. Even if you get over an episode, you're likely to have another episode. Now, here's the truth. The truth is that studies, follow-up studies show that only about half of all the people who are diagnosed as having depressive disorder actually ever have a recurrence. So already we're in a kind of problematic terrain. So what I said was, and the other thing is, people talk about, obviously, suicidality. These are the two things, let's say, if you picked out two outcomes that convinced people that this is a disorder, how can you think about something being normal if it leads to suicide? How can you think about something being normal if it basically makes you recurrently have that thing? It looks like something's gone wrong inside. So we did the following study. We used a large data set, and in general, in my research, I've used large data sets that are openly available and that allow you to explore questions like this in detail in a way that really wouldn't be possible in any other way. And what we did was we looked at, so the advantages of this particular study and this particular study that we used, it's a major epidemiological survey, the NESARC, and it had two waves. So in other words, everybody was evaluated at wave one for all their symptoms and their lifetime of symptoms before that. And then 3 years later, so the time interval is substantial, 3 years, they were reevaluated for everything that had happened in the 3 years since their first evaluation. Now, without going into all the technical details here, you can read all this. What's the essential point? The essential question is, let's suppose you go back to the distinction we made between general distress symptoms that are used to diagnose depression and the few that look like maybe they might suggest pathology. What if somebody has only these and none of these? Can you still say that they're possibly pathological? Because these folks are still classified according to DSM. If they have 5 or more symptoms, they're still classified according to DSM as being disordered. So what we asked was, if people have only the general distress symptoms and none of these few pathosuggestive, more extreme symptoms, should they be diagnosed as disordered? That's the question we asked. And with this study, we were able to look at that because what we did was we looked at the first survey, which categorized all the symptoms somebody had had, not only right at the time, but throughout their lives. And we looked at those people who throughout their lives had had depressive episodes, classified by DSM as having a full depressive episode. And yet, the symptoms they reported were within this domain of symptoms that weren't the pathosuggestive ones. And then we compared them to others who had the pathosuggestive symptoms and also had depression. So we're looking at only at people who had depression, diagnosable depression. Well, we'll also see the ones that didn't. Now, what are you seeing here in this chart? This chart is the outcome after 3 years of who had another, this is a recurrence, who had another major depressive episode that qualifies for DSM. Except for the first bar there, all these folks had at least one episode in the first wave. They were all had been classified as having major depression. These are 4 different groups. The first bar, the blue bar there, is a group that when they first evaluated them in the first evaluation, they had no history of major depression at all. No history. Not then, not throughout their lifetime. So then we looked at how many of them had a major depressive episode in the following 3 years. For people who never had it, what's the spontaneous rate at which people newly had? And you see the percentage there was 6.1. The next bar, the orange bar, is the number of people who reported having one major depressive episode, at least during their lifetime, in the first wave. Now, it turned out we had to do single. In another study, we generalized it to multiple, but here we had to do single for technical reasons having to do with the data. But the point is, it still makes the argument. These folks did have a major depression. At least they had it once. In the first wave, they reported it. But they only had we call them uncomplicated symptoms, the symptoms that were not of the more severe type. They were all classified as having major depression. Of that group, in the following 3 years, 6.9% had a major depressive episode. And you can see the bars there, significance bars. This is not significantly different at all. This is just within random chance. Between those who never had a disorder, never had a depression, and those that had a single episode of major depression. Now, what about those that had, just for the sake of control, only a single episode, but they had at least one of those more interesting pathosuggestive symptoms that we had identified in our initial evaluation of the symptoms? Look at that. That's 19.5%. So in terms of thinking about pathology of depression, and this was the single most powerful and compelling argument that sadness could be a disorder, was that this recurrence would happen. And Kraepelin used that as one of his arguments. You see here that argument does apply to, at a pretty high rate, 1/5 of them who had an episode that had symptoms of the pathosuggestive kind. But it does not apply to those who had symptoms that were not of the pathosuggestive kind. So this suggests, it's actually remarkable in 3 years that there's no increase. It suggests that these folks are being pathologized incorrectly. It suggests, for instance, that if you're a clinician and somebody comes into you like this, notice the first bar, instead of continuing to treat them to prevent a recurrence, you might as well pick somebody off the street that's walking past your window and treat them to prevent a recurrence, because there's not the difference in the odds of them having a recurrence within the next 3 years. And that's not all, folks. It also slices cucumbers. So what about the dreaded outcome of suicide attempt? We had to address this, because who cares about anything else if you've got a prediction of suicide attempt? Now, here we see that the group that had no complicated symptoms, those more severe types, had only a very tiny rate of suicide attempts, and that the group that had uncomplicated depression actually had significantly lower suicide attempts. Now, to some degree, this is rigged, because to have uncomplicated meant that you didn't report suicidal ideation, of course, at the time of the initial interview. But who knew if once you had depression, there'd be a high rate of suicidal ideation occurring in the next 3 years. What this shows is really quite fascinating, and it was supported by a much more elaborate study we did using 4 different large data sets, that if you screen for suicidal ideation and you get uncomplicated, people who didn't have suicidal ideation in their first episode, you actually have a strong predictive element that they're not going to get suicidal ideation in a subsequent episode. So here you see that you actually have, and you see, of course, again, that the people that had some of the complicated, the ones that we identified as more questionable, as indicating perhaps dysfunction, they had a significantly greater number of suicidal attempts. So, I'm sorry, I should be saying suicide attempt, not suicidal ideation, more serious. So what you have here is very strong evidence using the 2 most compelling variables used to justify classifying people as having major depression at a first episode, that there really is no grounds for suggesting that they have a pathology that inclines them to future difficulties. There were many stated objections and questions about this. We had a whole article in World Psychiatry responding to those with further data analyses. And what's interesting is we didn't know the answer actually before we answered, but what's interesting, all the data analyses supported this. So what this suggests is that for clinicians that are here or who might hear this at some point, what this suggests is the first 2 things. First of all, the standard advice, keep treating people indefinitely to prevent recurrence, because recurrence is very common and is almost inevitably going to be a threat down the line. This doesn't apply to the uncomplicateds that I've indicated. This is a powerful point because you can actually save people from continued drug medication or continued therapy on this basis. And secondly, it just suggests it's a kind of smoking gun that at least there is, so an initial point, there's lots more to talk about, but that we are diagnosing people who don't seem to have a pathology as rationalized by any of our justifications for calling it a pathology. And so it does call into question the validity of our diagnostic criteria. Now, the bereavement exclusion that I talked about before was eliminated from DSM, believe it or not, despite whatever I had to say about it. In the last epidemiologic survey, they said how much depression there is in the population. And then as a side note, they said, of the people who are classified as depressive, as having a depressive disorder in this study, I hope I'm getting this right, about 14%, I think it was more, but I think I may be, but in any event, about 14% are people who had their only depressive symptoms immediately following the loss of a loved one, and the depressive episode did not last more than 2 months. Now, one can ask, so you're talking about, a sizable chunk of all the people who are going to be diagnosed potentially as depressed. Are those really people suffering from a mental disorder? And there doesn't seem to be the will to do the work to figure this out. Okay, I know I'm coming to my time. I'm probably over my time. But can I take a few more minutes? Or will I try everybody's patience?
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's go to the Lamentation over Christ. This is a sculpture from the 1400s in Bologna. It's famous for portraying grief in various different guises. I'm showing it to you to remind you that grief is a universal. Grief is intense. Grief can be experienced in many ways. And to me, it's a fool's errand to suggest that grief has lockstep stages that if you're not in them, you should probably call yourself disordered. But that's what's been done in our field. And I'm not going to, unfortunately, I don't have the time, although it would be fun to go through all these characters and who they are and what their different relations are to Christ, who has just been brought down from the cross in this terracotta sculpture. One argument that grief is a disorder is that it's like a physical wound. Of course, the wound metaphor has been used since Greek times. Cupid's arrow. You're wounded by love. It's so intense that it's a wound. And maybe that's the example that shows that a wound isn't necessarily a disorder. Why? Because the wound in the case of grief is the belief, the adaptive, biologically designed ability to comprehend that a loved one is gone. That triggers the grief process. It's not literally a wound that destroys tissue that cannot function. Everything in grief is functioning the way that it is biologically designed to function. It's an emotion in response to a belief change. Now, I was going to talk today, there's so many aspects of this that it's could take another hour, but I was going to talk today about the stage theory. So there's a new disorder in the diagnostic manual called prolonged grief disorder. Supposedly you have this disorder if you still have fairly intense grief symptoms after a year, although the ICD did 6 months. The group that argued for this disorder category wanted 6 months, but DSM in its wisdom, in my view, insisted on a minimum of a year. I still don't think that was good enough, but okay. I am not saying there's no such thing as grief disorder. Everything, depending on your belief, everything either God or evolution designed can go wrong. And even humans designed. As you know, if you tangled with my printer this morning, everything designed by humans, God, or evolution can go wrong. So yes, grief is a biologically designed emotion, and yes, it can go wrong. So there is such a thing as grief disorder. Now the question is, when is it happening? Where are the breakpoints? How do you think about it? Now, there were a bunch of arguments used in this argument that it's a disorder and where to cut it. All I wanted to say here was a different kind of argument. That would make an interesting talk, another talk, but the stage theory. On the top, you see the prediction of what a stage theory by the very folks that published this article. This is what a stage theory says, that there should be initially disbelief, then yearning and distress, then depression, and finally acceptance. Now, and by the way, in the article, and this article was in no less than JAMA, believe it or not. Whoops. Whoops. Okay, that slide isn't here. In JAMA, they showed this. Now, what does this tell you? That the prediction of a stage theory, by its nature, it's a stage theory, is that in the different stages, the stage which it is will be stronger than the other things. They will be stronger. So if disbelief is the first stage, it will be stronger than the other emotions. They click in later. Now, there's certain logic to this. First, you can't believe it. Then you go into despair, depression, disorganization, as Bowlby called it, etc. There's a certain logic emotionally to this. And that there will be some separation here. That is, it's not just one continuous mess. It's actually that there will be stages where something happens more than the other things. Now, somehow, I think JAMA actually, for one time, JAMA, no less than JAMA, kind of got played here and scammed. Because somehow, this is the actual chart of the 200, wait a minute, this is this from of the 233 grief-stricken people that they followed. This is the actual data points. Now, this isn't as neat as it looks. They were taking randomly different data points from different people to average them out. So it's not the longitudinal intra-individual kind of measure that you would have liked. But what happens to people when they actually grieve? That was the point of this study. Let's look at what happened. What actually happened is that on average, acceptance started from the very beginning. It wasn't like later on after you went through a whole bunch of turmoil and stuff. A lot of people had a lot of acceptance, but they might have had other things at the same time. Look at this. Anger, disbelief, and depression are all the way down here through the whole process. They're not up there. There's no time at which they even remotely approach the most dominant feeling. The most dominant feeling by far throughout, these, by the way, the numbers, so that, the numbers down here represent the time from the loss. This is 6 months. And this represents how intense or frequent. So 1 is like less than once a month you felt this. 2 is once a month. 3 is, once every week or two. 4, I guess, is once a week. 5 is more frequently, something like that. So we see here that, in fact, yearning is the dominant emotion on average throughout the process. Now, they argue, the people who wrote this argue, that this actually fits. This is their adjusted graph. Now, how is that this? The way that is this, that is because what they did was they adjusted each of the emotions on a scale to make it equal through its range to all the others. So notice that within itself, disbelief starts at the highest point within itself, even though it's way lower than yearning or acceptance. And notice that, say, depression in this graph peaks
1
around,
minute left.
6 or 7 months. So what they did, but the problem here is that, yes, you can play with this and say that it isn't a stage model anymore. It doesn't explain what the stage theory was trying to explain and predict. Moreover, and this is the final thing I'm going to say, there were 2 versions of this, and the arguments that are made are questionable, and maybe I'll come back someday and explain it all. But the point is, they say, well, since a lot of things peak at 6 months, anything after 6 months can be considered potentially clinically of interest or pathology. Where I come from, in normally distributed human traits, it's not the peak that defines where pathology starts. It's a tail that defines where pathology, if you're going to use that system at all. I mean, we can argue that and question it. Tails sometimes can be adaptive. But the point is, it doesn't make sense, even as an argument to begin with, that just because the chart looks like this with some peaks here, that therefore everything to the right is going to be potentially pathological. But that's exactly what the argument was. Now, why was this argument made? And I'll finish here. It's because if you have a stage theory, and this is what they do, they conclude this shows what normal grieving is like. So everybody who doesn't match this is potentially of interest for clinical evaluation. So we have here what looks like an intellectual contribution, a stage theory, but it's being used as a move in a chess game to get your diagnosis into the DSM and have an argument that there is pathology, because it's so hard to make that argument. And the answer is that when you look at this in detail, it's playing with data in ways that I think don't really warrant any of that sort of conclusion. Now, they had lots of other arguments I can't go through today. Well, I hope that gives you just an quick look at the kinds of arguments that are going on right now in these areas, and why, for those of you who are clinicians, I would say approach the diagnosis of major depression and of prolonged grief disorder with some caution, with a broader perspective about people adapting to unusual circumstances, and don't automatically necessarily, at least as you think about the case, go by the criteria, which have many questions about them. Thank you. Sorry it took so long.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jerry, for a very, very rich and interesting talk. With regards to, I mean, I agree with you that psychiatry is way behind the rest of medicine. Yeah, Jerry's still there. It is way behind the rest of medicine conceptually. But what's your take as to why psychiatry hasn't benefited from the scientific revolution the way that the rest of medicine has? What is it about psychiatry that stands out from the rest of medicine this way?
I mean, that's one answer to that is, of course, very easy. The brain. We just don't. I mean, we don't. After a decade of the brain, after RDoc, the fact is, this is a level of problem of how the brain works, which, of course, our minds can be equated with the brain, with certain functions of the brain, psychological functions, all are rooted in the brain. Now, consciousness is another issue philosophically, but let's leave that aside. The point is, how we function psychologically is rooted in the brain, and we just don't understand how it works at this detailed level. I mean, RDoc proposed that the way you understand it is by circuit activation, but that's much too simplistic, obviously. Some circuits can be very activated and totally normal. Others can be lurking back there, not activated and totally normal. Clearly, the whole notion of so that's number one. It's a harder problem. Number two, adding to the problem is the intimacy of the relationship between psychiatry and society, because cultures are essentially, I mean, of course, cultures exist, as Marx would argue, materially to create economic products, and as others would have it, are essentially cognitive structures that regulate everybody in a certain way. But the fact of the matter is that cultures depend on psychological functioning, and therefore there's a kind of interface. And this is what gave rise to the anti-psychiatry movement, the feeling that psychiatry was being poised to become a kind of mental health enforcement arm of society. And although that's waned, I think, partly because of better diagnostic practices, I think with grief and depression, you see the harmful aspect of that. How are you going to ever find a real etiology of pathological depression if the very diagnostic categories you're using to attempt to diagnose and to sample selection, select samples, are so completely inundated with multiple etiologies that it's very hard to know how you can do it. So I think there's an irony here. Bob Spitzer achieved a major coup in uniting research diagnoses with clinical diagnoses. Putting those two together gave us an amazingly powerful system that enabled clinicians, for instance, to go to the literature and look up studies that studied people that met the criteria that the clinician was using. So it's an amazing coup, but it gave rise to one unexpected side effect. And that is that when the committees meet to reformulate DSM, they have an incentive to keep the disorder categories broad and to recognize people who are coming through the consultant's door in order to allow it all to be legitimate psychiatric intervention. This tends to be somewhat at loggerheads with a narrower view of validity that would meet maybe a more evolutionary conception that actually might lead to productive science. I think those are basically the reasons, and maybe, shall I say it, human impatience. I mean, from let's say leave Hippocrates out of it. From Harvey to statins, let's say, from Krepelin to a real way to address depression. Let's hope it's not that long. But the point is, these things do take an enormous amount of time. We're very impatient.
Thanks for that, Jerry. We have Annie and Randy. Annie, do you want to unmute yourself and put your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I was just wondering, because you mentioned that treating normal childbirth is something we do as doctors, the pain in normal childbirth. Couldn't we then argue that we also need to treat the pain of normal depression after grief, after bereavement?
We could. And I guess I sort of felt I was arguing that earlier when I said that anybody in intense distress and intense grief should be able to be helped, especially in a society like many of ours that have high mobility, lack of family support around, lack of, most of us, I'm afraid, haven't seen our clergy person in a long time. And so I think absolutely there's a moral case to be made. And there's even more of a moral case to be made where social demands themselves are imposing new stressors on us so that, people are distressed by these demands. And I've actually written a paper about that, saying that there's certain issues of justice that are as powerful as medical need that should be. Now, with issues in reproductive medicine, that has been one of the most successful expansions. In other areas, there hasn't been as much. I mean, think of cosmetic medicine. There are people suffering terribly from cosmetic issues that, afflict them, but we don't seem to have the same inclination to cover that domain. But with reproductive medicine, there have been arguments made on the Supreme Court of the United States before it took its current turn, by the female members, by the way, of the Supreme Court, just showing a certain usefulness in having a diversity at that level, that argued that this is so fundamental to people exerting their liberties that reproductive medicine should allow for expansion beyond sheer medical need, abortion, birth control, so on and so forth. So all that in threat right now due to the craziness on our Supreme Court. So the point is, I agree with you completely. The problem is when you say, can you make an argument? The argument doesn't seem to have the same force as it does for reproductive medicine thus far. So if one can come up with better rationales, I mean, I can make an incredibly powerful argument for marital therapy. I mean, children are at stake, marriages are at stake. I mean, and yet this has consistently been rejected. It's proposed every single iteration of DSM. There's a powerful constituency that says we must put marital distress in as a disorder. So instead, it's in the Z codes, which don't get coverage in America. And you can make an incredibly powerful argument that that should be covered. So I'm with you. It's a policy issue. It's a social issue. Any contribution to how to do it, I'm all ears.
Thank you.
Randy, last question.
So are we actually out of time, Riyadh? I think I can talk with Jerry another time if
Oh,
we
no,
should
no,
be
no.
closing up.
Please put your question,
Okay.
Randy.
Okay. So first of all, Jerry, I mean, what an impressive, articulate summary of a life's work you've presented very briefly. But here's the big question. I mean, you've demonstrated beyond unassailably your main points here repeatedly over decades with data, and it hasn't really changed much. And I think it's time to take a new approach. I mean, rational arguments have not had the impact they should in our field. This is true all across science and politics. I mean, this is a larger issue. But I think you may be in a special position with your broad background and knowledge about sociology and culture and philosophy to take this other perspective. You hinted at it a minute ago, saying, well, maybe it has to do with reimbursements. And maybe it also has to do with identity and group formation, other things. I would love to see you, take some of these things and see why the hell people aren't acknowledging them and acting on them.
Yeah, look, it's I'd be lying if I said it wasn't an immense disappointment to me that all the effort I put in on this has not paid off in terms. There are two things in DSM that I think are due to me. One is in conduct disorder. Way back when I was arguing about conduct disorder, a letter to Alan Francis did lead to something put in the text that a child in a dangerous or threatening neighborhood that joins a gang and then engages in gang-related antisocial acts because he's part of the gang doesn't necessarily have a mental disorder, which he would have if that wasn't in there. But of course, that was in the text. So nobody took any account of it anyway in epidemiological surveys. And one person said to me straight out, no subterfuge, Jerry, if I took the view that you put forward, NIMH would have a reason to stop funding me because I'm studying non-disorders. So yes, this is a really major issue. I have thought about it. I have thought about sending something to the revision committee and asking them. Now, technically speaking, a lot of the studies that I did came out at around the time of DSM-3 or shortly thereafter. So I know that the chair of the DSM-5 committee said to me, gee, I didn't really know about a lot of this. Maybe it would have come up for discussion. But look, Randy, you're basically right. This calls for more than sheer intellectual output. Maybe I don't have entirely the personality for it, but
no, I think you're the perfect person. But if you wrote a research proposal for how we're going to do the studies to try to identify the factors that are keeping people, I mean, Wellcome might support it, Templeton might support it, Russell Sage Foundation right there in New York might well want to support this kind of thing. And again, you're the perfect person to do it.
I do actually think, and then in the getting rid of the bereavement exclusion, they ended up putting in a note that basically takes back everything they do, but it's only a note. Again, they can evade it in epidemiological surveys, but it's a note that acknowledges almost everything I've been arguing about. So the issue is the evidence is there. It is a gross situation where the evidence is all out there, a decade of my life, and it's been ignored, essentially. Right. What do you do in that condition, in that situation? I'm all ears. We'll talk about this.
Compare it to people wanting ivermectin for COVID.
Yes, right.
So thank you so much.
Or naltrexone for grief. Did I mention that? Once it's a disorder, you look for a medical solution, right? So they're proposing to use naltrexone, which is used for addiction, because to give it to people with complicated grief that lasts more than 6 months or a year. Why? Because naltrexone, being anti-addictive, blocks attachment feelings. Just what a person grieving needs is to have no ability to reattach. To me, it's insane, but that's another talk. I'm sorry, there was somebody else. Thank you.
A bit of tongue-in-cheek question to you, Jerry. Do you think that biomedicine has actually led us astray? I mean, I'm guessing that if you were talking to a bunch of shamans, you wouldn't have to convince them that, that bereavement is a natural psychological human response, would you?
No, you're absolutely right. There is we've gone in a direction. I mean, I'm not like, an ideological anti-drug or anti-brain or anti-anything. I'm about science and figuring it out, and with conceptual integrity. But you are right. There's a certain view that leads you step by step. It's all about the brain. The brain is all there really is. And therefore, anything in the brain that you can identify is okay to identify as a disorder if it's different than, I don't know, what I'm doing when I'm not aggrieved. So it is true. And this is one of the reasons, and I know it's shunned by many in our field, but one of the reasons that I support, hopefully, the further advancement of psychotherapy, of cognitive behavioral therapy, of interpersonal therapy, and of psychoanalysis, if it's purged of some of the nuttiness from its past, which I've spent a little time recently working on. These areas are being eclipsed by biomedicine. There's been complete takeover, maybe for the good temporarily, of the medical schools and the hospitals by biologically oriented psychiatrists from a very different situation years ago. And they are not as oriented. Even the early biological folks were at least evolutionarily oriented a bit. They're not oriented towards broader theory like this and towards experience, towards consciousness, towards the range of human emotion, towards psychological stuff. You read the journals and you can rip out your hair if you have some left. That it's very frustrating that there's not a balance here. So I agree with you. This is a matter of the field. I hope it will self-correct as it does over time, but very frustrating. Sorry,
we need to bring this to a close, unless there is a burning question. I can't see any hands or anything. So we are a bit over time. A fascinating talk. I'm sure this will be very popular on our YouTube channel. I hope a lot of people watch this. It's going to be a great resource for psychiatrists and psychologists. Thanks again, Jerry, for a great talk. And thank you for contributing to our webinar series.
Oh, thanks so much.